I'm very happy to be here and happy to give you a chance to talk about this. Since we've been thinking about this intensively for 6 months, I'm always surprised when I meet people who don't really know about it. But one of my own junior faculty came to me, who does development, came to me and didn't actually know about it. So I'm happy to have a chance to talk about it. So I just by way of introduction, I would say that this is very much result of an email from Ted about the potential for this, and I was, I think, naturally conservative about it, but fortunately Dean Carlin was there, and Dean was also skeptical about it, but we sort of talked and agreed that we would give it a try. Dean has done the sort of most of the work, most of the heavy lifting, and so that was why he was sort of scheduled to give this talk. He couldn't be here, and I'm very happy to fill in using sort of his slides. And I also want to thank Alex, who's been involved in BITS, has been very helpful by providing some extra resources. One of the real concerns that came up when we were talking about this pilot was it's extra work for a journal editor, and frankly, being a journal editor is enough work. Okay, so let me just start sort of, by way of motivation. I won't necessarily follow the slides so closely since I didn't really make them. But when I think about this project, I was sort of reminded of, the three-legged stool behind the ACA. That there's sort of three pieces that kind of go together. And unless you have all three, you're kind of missing something. And the first is obviously this idea of pre-registration, setting out a plan, committing yourself to a particular activity. But that by alone certainly does some things, but it also leads to perhaps a bunch of stuff that's still on the shelf if editors don't comply. And it also might limit the kinds of work that people might be willing to do. And so the sort of second element of the three-legged stool would be insurance. And the idea would be to essentially for the journal to be willing to accept articles regardless of what the results are. So in that sense, a person is insured against the outcome that they have, the particular sample that they're in, and so forth. But of course, that's the second level to this insurance. But the third level is screening. Obviously, if I'm going to insure authors against the sort of possibility that their survey, their study will yield a null result, I want to have some say over what that study is to begin with, and perhaps even some influence on what that study looks like as a journal editor. And so the sort of idea here is that pre-results review, which is what we're talking about, what we're piloting here, is kind of this next stage. The sort of pre-analysis deals with the first of the sort of legs of the stool, but the second two, the insurance and screening, are things that I think we're able to handle through pre-results review. So that was sort of the idea. And I should say this insurance business, as we began to think about it, we began to realize there's sort of a whole variety of ways that the insurance arises. The first is kind of the sampling issue. You sort of set up a sample and you happen to get a sample where the result where the result is not rejected, even though perhaps it would have been rejected if you had the entire population. There's that issue. Another issue is scooping. So you may actually start out doing a study and then find out somebody else did a study or somebody does a study at the same time, and then you're no longer able to publish it. So we're insuring against that possible outcome. We're also in some sense insuring against the outcome that the truth is A versus B. There's some questions where there's a 5% chance that A would be true, and you might not want to take care of that analysis if you could never publish the 90% of the times when it wasn't true. And so we're sort of insuring against the state of the world, and I think that's quite important, and it allows people to perhaps undertake kinds of research that they might do otherwise. And for me, that was really the biggest selling point for this program, that it allows us to encourage particularly young researchers to take on the kinds of projects that have perhaps some more risk of various kinds, and ensure that they will that if the work stands up to a certain quality, at least on the proposal stage, that we'll be able to publish it and they'll be able to carry it through. And so it's not just a matter of publishing work that is already existing, but also thinking we might be able to move the needle on the kind of work that is done. Also to move the needle on how we identify young scholars in the field, to provide some early identification of who's doing interesting work, and so forth. And that's obviously also critical for the long-run success of the field. And even though there may be some benefits to what we're doing now that accrue to other journals in the JDE, in the end, we're interested in advancing the field of development economics, and in my sense is that this is a chance to do that. So let me talk a little bit about kind of the details so you get a sense of that, and perhaps there'll be some questions about about how we should handle things. So this was launched as a pilot in March 2018 as part of this partnership. And the sort of what facilitated it, actually, although it's been something a challenge in other ways, was Elsevier, which is the parent company for JDE, insisted that we switch platforms. Now, of course, they're now about to switch platforms again because this one didn't work out so well. But one of the key aspects was that, I saw early on that one of the boxes you had to tick was, did you want to do registered reports? And I realized that the registered reports they were asking about set up a kind of, was exactly designed for the kind of thing that was being proposed here. So it was fairly easy when we introduced the new platform to start accepting this idea of a registered report, which is the term that Elsevier chose for this pre-analysis review. And so the idea is that people design and research and develop their projects. They send us a pre-analysis a plan of some sort, and we send it out for peer review. It comes back to us. Sometimes we send it back to the author to get some revisions because the referees don't like some aspect of the design, and then we will essentially provisionally accept that work, and then they will collect and analyze the data and write up the paper, and we are committed to publishing the paper as long as people follow through on their primary commitments. Obviously, there has to be some flexibility, and we spend a lot of time arguing among ourselves about how much flexibility. At one point, would we say no? In the bottom line, we figured we would try to be sort of open-minded, at least initially, and as we get through the pilot and see what the issues are, perhaps be able to set up more of a menu. But we didn't think there was any point in setting up a very detailed menu without knowing exactly what we would face. Okay, so there are, as part of this, and this was a key contribution of BITS, was to set up a series of sort of detailed instructions and an FAQ, because when we sort of started to release this, the questions came in the door fast and furious, and Dean and I just forwarded them to Alex, and then he would either provide an answer we already provided or ask us to construct one, and then we'd go back and forth. And so as things have gone along, we've got a sort of nice set of FAQs that have answered most of the questions that people would have. Some of you may have them today. If we have time, I'm happy to address them. Happy to address them offline. But you're also more than welcome to look at the FAQ. The other thing that we totally didn't realize is that once we sent out when we started sending this out to the referees, that the referees also would need instructions. They had no experience in this sort of thing, so we started developing an FAQ there. And I have to say I've been very pleased that, at least within the development community, a very high fraction of the people who've received our first stage papers have agreed to at least try it out and have provided, I think, very helpful information for the authors. So that's been very much a pleasure, and certainly reflects, I think, the spirit in the field that these issues of open science matter. To give you a sense of where we are, we sort of started in March. We have these two stages. This pre-results review stage. So we have about 21. We've received 21 proposals. Okay, and we were thinking that 15 was a good number, so that's pretty good. In terms of adjudication, we're all busy people and things, and we're dealing with referees, so we don't have full control over the returns. But 57% had a duration review of 8 weeks on average, which is a bit shorter than certainly first review on a regular JDE paper, as hard as we work to change that. And up to date, 2 of them have been accepted. That's about 18 weeks. There were 10 rejected, an average of 6 weeks. And 9 are currently under review. So things are kind of moving along at a good pace. I think we're very, very pleased about that, and certainly acceptance rates is higher than we expected. Now I should say that the articles we received as the pilot stage have not surprisingly been by sort of more senior scholars, perhaps less diverse scholars, and frankly scholars who are interested in what we're doing and so forth. To some extent, we think that the long-term beneficiaries of this program will most likely be younger scholars, but the ones that we've seen to date have been the more senior ones, and I want to sort of talk a little bit about that. Reasons for rejections, so potential no results, may be uninformative and imprecise, so that's certainly an issue. We try to assess statistical power. Obviously, that's a little bit of guesswork in any paper because you don't know exactly what you're going to be facing in the data, depending on what sort of happens. I think, what's really important is we are assessing the potential contribution to the literature. So we got a lot of, initial people just wanted to send us their pre-registration sort of documents, like this is what we're going to do. But that's not what we're looking for. We're actually looking for the kind of the front of a paper which says why this is an interesting question, how it relates to the literature, why we should care about the answer. And so that really makes us very different. And so if you're going to submit, that's one thing that you want to keep in mind. We're really looking for something, at least the first part, that looks like a paper that really justifies why this is an important question. And that's one of the primary bases on which we're making a decision. And then, of course, the research design needs to needs to be clearly reported, and there needs to be sufficient detail that at least we have a pretty good sense of what you're going to do, and so forth, so that we have some standard and we get to measure what comes back at the end of the analysis. Okay, just to talk briefly about the acceptor proposals. There's one by David McKenzie. It looks at management practices and export among small to medium enterprises. So you serve an RCT for management training, 200, and mostly looking at export performance, seeing if providing these kinds of skills and so forth. So there was kind of an innovative aspect of this, which also raised some questions for us. So there was a desire to look at this from a frequentist perspective as well as a Bayesian perspective. That raised the issue for one of the referees, and sensibly so. If you're going to be Bayesian, you have to say something about priors, and if you don't pre-specify your priors, are you really sort of doing your job? And so it turned out we were able to get an answer that was satisfactory on that, and we think that's sort of what made this study innovative. It might be that the question itself wasn't, while interesting, perhaps didn't necessarily push us into this is a key question for the JDE, but there was this methodological aspect that was interesting, and it was extremely clear in terms of how it was written out. The challenge is the sample size is small. I think there's a possibility that we won't be able to reject the null simply because the standard errors will be large. And as I mentioned, there was this issue with the Bayesian framework, which came up. Okay. Second proposal by Eric Edmonds and Carolyn Theoharidis, looking at productive asset transfers in families with child labor, looking at the Philippines, a clustered RCT. Looking at assets, fairly large sample size, looking at productive activities, policy, there's a direct policy relevant, focused on child labor, something that obviously Eric has done a lot of work on. And again, the methodology was thorough and detailed. This reflects the work of two senior scholars who kind of know what they're doing, which we can't always, I think, expect going down the road. One of the issues that came up very early on was, well, what do we do if the data are already being collected or had been collected and so forth? In some sense, this is pre-results review or results blind review, but there's obviously a problem if the data have already been collected in terms of our ability to assess whether someone has actually looked at the data before they actually sort of gave us our results, which would kind of defeat the purpose. On the other hand, my position on this from the start was like, when you submit a paper to us, we believe a lot of what you tell us. Like, we believe you actually went out in the field and actually, answered a question. And so, in the end, if we're going to be trusting authors to do many things, we could probably trust them a little bit. But we were also a little nervous about that. And we were quite expansive in terms of allowing people who had already collected the data. I think a better model for us is maybe you've collected a baseline, but you haven't yet collected the end line, because then we really have a credible case that you haven't actually used the results to do it. And even, if you've collected the end line and not looked at it, you still probably, somebody has been looking for outliers and identifying problems and so forth. So there's plenty of time for feedback and so forth. So going forward, we're going to try to focus we're considering now papers in which they're sort of, the data have already been collected. We're going to use the end line basis in the future. Okay. And there was some question about, there are a number of asset grant programs that look at other aspects. So there's some question of innovation, but we thought it was worth giving a try given the other strengths of this proposal. One of the things we learned, obviously we weren't the first, we understand we're the first economics journal to do this, but it was quite common in some other, or reasonably common in other fields. Some people had run some experiments, one political science journal, which the editor wrote a fairly scathing article about how terrible the idea was after he'd tried it out. But there were some specific things to development that came out in this process, okay? And one of the key things is just that, it takes us time to do stuff. In psychology, if you have a lab, there's some psychologists in the room that correct me if I'm wrong, you do a proposal, you bring people in, and you can write up the results. Whereas with many developments, it's a matter of going to a country, setting a program in motion. There's a possibility of a coup, delays data collection, the minister gets overthrown and your program is canceled. So there's a lot of things that can happen in the middle. And so, we had to figure out how we're going to balance that. And that will be a learning experience going forward. I think there's some notion that as long as the changes were exogenous to you, like you didn't actually create the coup, then then maybe it's okay. But if you actually changed the program, then you violated sort of the spirit of what you had told us you were going to do. So we're going to adapt these researches along, and we're going to learn things, and we're going to keep people informed and so forth. Okay. There are issues of publicity. One of the, we wanted to say, in fact, for the author's benefits, that this article has been accepted for pre-results review, and maybe put an abstract describing the results. But one of our co-authors was saying, well, if people know about the purpose of this study, they might actually find out about it. Maybe not so much for households in rural India, but maybe firms in some other country. Right? And so we actually decided not to release very much information so that there wasn't the possibility that people would learn the purpose of the study who were actually in the study. And the other thing that's really very important is that not every paper that would be submitted to the JDE is going to be suitable for this method, and JDE is committed to be a journal that feeds and helps to nurture the field of development economics as a whole. So this will remain, even as the pilot goes forward, and if we adapted a standard procedure, a subset of what we do. And I think that's certainly appropriate. So I've talked about the significant deviation stuff that we need to think about. I've talked about we're going to focus on proposals for which the data has not yet been collected, except for some baseline. And in accepted articles, will be the second stage review. We haven't done, so I can't tell you how that part of the pilot has gone. And I think in general, what has sort of been clear to us is that the discipline is sort of open and ready to do this. And so from my perspective, the pilot's been successful. Frankly, as an editor, it has brought my journal a lot of visibility, which is, I think, a good thing. And, I think one of the things we debated about that I haven't talked about is what do we do for young researchers who submit a phase one and then decide that they're able to publish this in a very top journal. And we sort of negotiated and thought a lot about that and argued about it. And in the end, we came to the view that as long as we could publish what actually happened to the article, we had met sort of our burden, and that in the end, we wouldn't want to restrict people from submitting to articles because they thought it might go on. So we've agreed to sort of leave a space open for the article while the author submits to a top journal if they wish to. At some point, we probably will put a statute of limitations on that. Right now, there is not, because we're not sure how clear that is. But we think it's in the interest of our field for people to publish their best work in the top journals. That helps them. It helps the field. So we didn't want to get away from that, and that's why we've been open about that. Okay. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to leave time if there are questions about either why we did this or particular details for those of you who might be interested in thinking about doing something like this in your own journals, or in fact sending us something to review. So questions? Yes, up front, here.
Yeah, two questions actually. One obviously is the big problem will come when you actually get to the stage 2 submissions about what criteria are going to apply to those. Do you have any guidelines already set up for the reviewers who are going to be the key piece of that? The second question is one which may or may not be related, but this came up in a different discussion elsewhere about registered reports. The whole process is quite similar to what's already going on for grant proposals. And so the obvious next step might be to partner, not necessarily with BITS, but with an actual grant agency to sort of run through this process that essentially says, I'm going to fund you, I'm going to review what you're doing, and I'm going to guarantee that your results are going to be published and don't just disappear somewhere, which grant agencies have a strong interest in doing. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so let me take the first question. So we've developed a series of questions in the FAQ about what things we will allow, and those we made available to the referees in the second stage. And a lot of it turns on this question, is did you actually manipulate things, or did something happen, but the basic design is going to continue? Obviously, those things need to be documented. That's really important. We've also allowed, and there was again some debate about this, if in the process of doing this work you have some inductive results or some additional things, you're allowed to include those. They just need to be demarcated as such, so it's very clear. And so I think it's going to be very hard to provide specific guidelines. I think as co-editors, as Dean and I will play a heavy role here in both trying to guide the reviewers, and frankly, if we felt the reviewers have gone overboard one way or the other, to overrule them. I think it's up to us to make those decisions in the long run. But I think the guidelines we provide to the author provide a pretty good sense that there's lots of room for the kinds of things that normally happen, some attrition, some this and that, as long as those things are documented. I should note it that in some journals, like psychology journals, there's like a requirement that for every change you make, it sort of comes back to the editors. And Dean and I decided we didn't really want that because of all the things, my interviewer died. Now what do I do? I mean, there's that in the end, we're going to have a little bit more play there. And it's obviously it's not a pure thing. So I think that's so on the grant thing. We sort of talked about various aspects. I think the there's sort of a chicken and egg problem unless we're actually partnered with grant agencies, right? And so I could imagine some situation like that where we sort of, part of your NSF submission was the JD has reviewed this and made something, made a thing. So I think that's certainly possible. I'm not sure we really would necessarily want to set up a bunch of partnerships, but one of the reasons we wanted to publicize the information is that that would then be available to the author to bring, among other places, to a grant agency and says the JD has investigated this and decided that they would publish this article. Yeah, I think that's correct. On the other hand, the flip side for us is we don't want you to sort of submit ideas that have no funding, because then we're spending a lot of time reviewing your article for something that will never be done. And so there's a little bit of a concern. That's another reason that this is a pilot. If that turns out to be a problem where we're reviewing stuff and then nothing ever happens, well, then we're going to try to have to sort of nail that down in some way if we adopt this full time. Other questions? There's one back there? Yes?
It seems to me that pre-result review has a unique chance to quantify how surprising a result is. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on eliciting prior beliefs of referees, and thereby using that to quantify the contribution once the results come in.
Well, I certainly say I hadn't thought about it, but since we were just talking with one of the people presenting yesterday, I was like, it was going through my head. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think maybe 2 referees, I don't think is enough. I mean, one might want a broader sort of source for that. I think it also may be partly, subjective or not, the job of the co-editors to try and sort out, is this something that's really, an innovative, potentially innovative contribution to the field. But, I think that the complexity is sort of it's not just things that are surprising, maybe, that are going to be important. There has to be a balance of things, and if you try to make it too specific to one criteria, you kind of miss out on the other. So I see it as kind of, more than anything else, an editorial decision. But it's an interesting thought, and I would be happy to discuss with any of you, more about if there's some concrete way of doing this which doesn't distort some of our other purposes. Yes?
What extent is the sort of median pre-analysis plan? I mean, do you get an entire introduction to a paper and then 3 blank tables that have the things in it in the code, or is it that you I'm going to run these regressions with these general?
It's more like the latter. I mean, we have seen, we as part, Alex did a very detailed survey of what this meant in other journals, and we certainly have seen the sort of enormous, give us the paper, with the tables missing, and then you just stick them in there. That did not seem sort of appropriate for us. So we're really, specify the design, specify the analysis, how the inference is going to work, give us the power calculations as best you can, and we will, judge from there. Obviously, the ones we've gotten in the door, have been, I think, fairly complete. We've been, reasonably happy, although both of them went through a little bit of revision. But yeah, we're not looking for a full paper in that sense. that we might have.
Could you expand on why it didn't make sense to you to have the tables blanked out?
Well, partly was this. Partly it was the willingness to the understanding that there would be some inductive learning that might be added that might enrich the paper. We didn't want to constrain that, so we'd have to have some room for that. We'll have the document, and I think some of what is learned, interpretation, is of some relevance. Again, you have the tables and so forth, but you can't really interpret them until you know what the answers are or try to make sense of them. And so we certainly had to have more than just the papers or the tables. Now, in principle, we could have the papers and tables plus maybe a section, which is like everything else we learned, but that seemed awkward to us. Again, this is a pilot. If we find that that's troublesome or that we really want something that's a more precise description of the paper that will come, then we can sort of consider that. But so far, I think I'm comfortable with the decision that we made. Yeah.
Based on the experience of results per line review with other journals, I'm curious how you'll judge the success or failure of the pilot and how you'll guard against the dissenting voices, both in reviewers and in those that think that the results are less interesting or largely null, for example, which is likely to be a possibility.
I think, yeah. So, I mean, I said from the start that my objective was that the papers that we published in this mechanism would be at least as good as the papers that we're publishing in other mechanisms in some measure. I think so far there's been some very favorable sort of positive selection for the journal, I think there is that potential that people who are seeing this, at least as long as we're the only journal that does this, we may get some people who might think about going elsewhere. So in that sense, that's good for the journal. Now I'm thinking about it as an editor, of course, not necessarily as a scientist, right? As an editor, if I get good names on good papers in my journal, then the journal is better, and then I think the field is better. So that's, I've been sort of thinking about it that way. And that's what I'm looking for rather than sort of some scientific basis. I imagine there will be some heterogeneity, right? I don't want to just measure, you could imagine that null results will be less cited than others, but I'm not so convinced of that. I think if you really have a good, creative, and innovative idea, which is what we're looking for at the pre-analysis stage, then people will understand that idea was worth thinking about. Maybe they'll tweak it and so forth. So it's not so obvious to me when push comes to shove that if we're getting good papers in the door and we're doing a good job with pre-analysis plans, that even a bunch of null results will be sort of not influential, at least within the field of development as I understand it. Now, it may not be true everywhere. But I don't know that for sure. I mean, I could be, in 5 years when we publish the phase 2, I'll be convinced that it was a mistake. But hopefully I won't be still the editor. So. Any other questions? All right, thank you.